What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? Today we are going to do sort of a part two to the video I did on how to use a welder on a generator, and we're going to look somewhat at that as well as the feasibility of what you can get for a welder on 120 volts, so your standard lower voltage house outlets. What is the possibility of welding on that? So let's get into it. With the modern invention of inverter welders, the ability to weld on 120 volts actually became a possibility versus before when you had your Lincoln Tombstone stick welders and your dial arcs and all those big old clunkers. Running those on 120 volt was completely impractical because basically all you would get for output is about 30 to 40 amps before it would trip the breaker, and that's basically useless. So modern welders, it's very common for them to be dual voltage, and it's very common for them to come with an adapter like this, which you plug your welder in here, and then this allows you to plug into a standard 20 amp outlet. Now, keyword 20 amp. There are 15 amp outlets, and if that's all you got and you're not on a 20 amp circuit, guess what? You're going to trip that breaker trying to weld on it. So a single 20 amp dedicated 120 volt circuit, like what would be commonly found in most garages, is able to support some welding. The question is how much, and then the next question is how feasible is it to use 120 volt on a generator to power a 120 volt welder. So we're going to look at basically everything to do with 120 volt. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, guys. If that's all you have to work with, you're in trouble, because there just simply is not enough power there to really get a lot of useful output unless you have a very expensive welder. And I'll explain all of that in this video. But to start things off, let's do some book learning on the wattage that's actually available on a simple 120 volt circuit. So to start things off, we need to discuss outlets, and this is in North America. You guys over the pond and Europe and you name it do things a lot differently than we do. So this is primarily discussion in North America, which we use single phase 120 volt and single phase 240 volts. In North America, you have two common 120 volt outlets that you might find in your garage or in your house. One is what's called the 20 amp outlet, where it looks just like the 15 amp outlet. However, it has a slot that goes to the side for a specific plug that's rated at 20 amps. This is going to be common more or less in garages, especially in newer construction, possibly in your kitchen for appliances, as well as possible exterior outlets on a home. Now, this is technically what should be hooked to a 20 amp breaker. However, due to the electrical code here in this country, you can actually find 20 amp breakers hooked to what is a 15 amp plug. And I'm not going to get into the whole deal behind that because that's a whole nother topic. But what you need to know is that if you see a outlet like this with a sideways slot in it, that you have a 20 amp circuit. If your outlet looks like this, you have what's called a 15 amp circuit. Now, that does not mean that you don't have a 20 amp breaker on that, but the outlet itself is really a 15 amp circuit. Now, if you notice on this, this has a 15 amp plug, which I've always found kind of ridiculous that it would have that, since under no circumstances does a 15 amp outlet, if that's what the breaker rating is and that's what the wire size is, should really be hooked to a welder of any kind. There simply isn't enough power there, but whatever, that's just how things are. Sometimes you just gotta accept that a lot of things aren't really what I would consider being code legal, but it is what it is. So anyways, the point of what I'm making here is, if you have the sideways prong, you got a 20 amp circuit. If you have straight up and down for your prongs, for your outlet, you need to look at your breaker that's hooked to that and see if you have a 15 amp rated or a 20 amp. If you have a 15 amp rated breaker, you will likely trip it with any kind of welder that you're running, especially if it's not a dedicated circuit. Now, regarding the dedicated circuit, what I mean by that is it's very common to have, say, 10 outlets all wired to one breaker, and you have multiple things plugged into it. That will severely limit what your welder can actually run on before you trip the breaker. So you need to verify what else is plugged into your 120 volt outlet before you go plug in your welder in. The easiest way to do that is find the breaker for that, shut it off, and see what doesn't work anymore. If half your house no longer has ceiling lights and your outlet in the garage doesn't work, well, you're going to have a major issue in trying to weld anything off of that low of power, because everything combined with your welder will add to the drain that's on that breaker and will likely trip it. Now, speaking also of breakers, you need to have 12 gauge wire wired to a 20 amp outlet. That is code. If you have 14 gauge wire welded to a 20 amp outlet like this, or to a 15 amp outlet, again, you're going to have limitations in how much power you can pull. If for whatever reason you have a 20 amp breaker and 14 gauge wire, that's a big no-no. You could end up melting that wire by drawing too much current. So again, to simplify it, if you have a 20 amp breaker, it should have 12 gauge wire. If you have a 15 amp breaker, it should have 14 gauge wire. Hopefully that all makes sense. Now let's look at some hard numbers of the battle that we're up against dealing with this. So these are simple math problems. We are calculating how much wattage is available. On face value, a 15 amp breaker will only allow approximately 1,800 watts of power through it before the breaker trips. Now, the reality is that's not that simple. Breakers will all allow quite a significant overload for quite a significant amount of time before they trip. So 15 amp breaker, this is face value. Anything over this for an extended period of time will cause the breaker to trip, but welders are very intermittent use. So oftentimes a 15 amp breaker, you might be able to get 22 to 25 amps while you're welding through that 15 amp breaker before it trips. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but for right now, we're just going to go by face value ratings. So 1,800 watts, 2,400 watts for a 20 amp, a 30 amp, which is pretty uncommon in a house. However, on generators, very commonly have a 30 amp 120 breaker and outlet. That does not look like this. That is a different style, but that's 3,600 watts. So with this in mind, let's look how much welder you can actually run on these. So this is a lot of information here, and we're going to go through it quickly so we're all on the same page. Over here I left what each breaker rating and the wattage that is associated with that breaker rating. And we're going to look at how that relates to how much power with welders that you can get out of that. So a standard 120 volt MIG welder universally is limited to about 140 amps in theory. Most of them operate at about 21 volts output. So if we take that output and take the input wattage and divide that input wattage by its output, we can get approximate amperage that the machine can output. Now, I got to say this right away. This is assuming the machine is 100% efficient and has a perfect power factor. I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but that does not happen in a real world. It's impossible. Therefore, the lack of efficiency of a machine will come into play, because these are the absolute maximum numbers we can get, but due to inefficiencies, it's actually less. So with a MIG machine that operates at 21 volts, which is very common for 120 volt MIG machines, these are the theoretical maximum amperages we can get out, absolute maximum. On a 15 amp breaker, it's 86 amps. On a 20 amp breaker, 114, 30, 171. Now you're probably asking yourself, well, that's a load of BS, because I have a Lincoln Electric 140 amp MIG welder that's rated at 140 amps and it runs on a 20 amp breaker no problem. Well, yes, you are correct. However, the reason it operates on that is because it exploits the way that the breaker trips. Breakers have a magnetic trip and they have a thermal trip. It's below the loading that trips it instantaneously, but above the thermal limit. Therefore, you have anywhere between, say, a minute, minute and a half on that breaker at, say, 140 amps output of the machine before the breaker will trip. Well, due to the intermittent nature of the welder, you're able to give that breaker time to cool between when you're welding, and then you don't wind up tripping the breaker. So I hate to break it to you, all 120 volt welders overload circuits because the theoretical maximum at 100% efficiency is 114 amps. That's all the power that is there by the breaker's rating. You have to overload the breaker to get to a higher output level. That's just how it is, okay? So now let's look at the TIG. TIG, because it operates at much lower voltage, and by the way, the 16 volts is on the high side, it typically would be less than that. You can get 112 amps of output on 15 amp, 150 on 20, and 225 on a 30 amp, 120 volt breaker. Stick welding operates at a higher voltage than both MIG and TIG, therefore the amperage that you can get out of it is lower, only 75 amp, 100 and 150. So based on this simple chart here, we can make a couple assumptions. One, if you want the highest amperage output on 120 volt, using a TIG machine will give you more amperage, okay? And if you want maybe not the best output, but decent output, MIG will generally output more than stick because its voltage it operates at is less than stick. So that gives you something to think of, because if you want to do work to repair stuff, say in your garage, and you only have a 20 amp circuit, no doubt TIG would be your highest output that you can get with universally with any welder, simply because the voltage it runs at on the output is so low. The downside to all of this is, like with MIG, MIG is a very low penetration process in the short circuit process, and unfortunately, when you're running on 120 volts, your ability to weld anything over about 3/16 thick with proper penetration is very limited. So in a lot of cases, MIG, in my opinion, isn't really the way you should be going about welding for 120 volt. If you're doing sheet metal and auto body and stuff up to maybe 1/8 inch, no problem. A MIG machine will probably take care of you. If you start talking 1/4 inch plates and thicker, TIG and stick are really your only options on 120 volt, because you simply can't get enough power to run the wire processes to get proper fusion. But that's a whole nother topic that I could get into another day, and I kind of already have numerous ways on this channel. So you got a little bit better of an idea of this. Let's look at what the practical limits are, assuming overloads on the circuits and efficient machines versus inefficient. I know, Jesus, you're thinking all this math is too much, but what I'm doing here is teaching you how to figure out a solution to your own problem, because this problem is that every welder is different. And this isn't as simple as like a lot of people want it to be. That's why I'm showing you this, so that you yourself can figure out an accurate representation for your situation, so you don't waste money on having a generator that's too small that isn't going to work, or you're trying to get too much power that an outlet won't support. So this is a very realistic, real world number that we're going to calculate here, and it's simpler than it looks, so please stay with me. MIG welding operates at 21 volts. A high efficiency MIG welder will only achieve about 0.84 efficiency. And that's pushing it, because MIG has an electric motor that feeds the wire. They typically have displays. They take more current from the wall to operate than both TIG and stick welders, generally speaking, because primarily that electric feed motor. So 0.84, and the reason this matters is you take whatever breaker rating you have, and these are the actual wattage that you can probably get from that breaker. Yes, this is overloading that breaker. That is what all 120 volt welders do. They overload breakers. This is nothing new, and people have argued with me over that, but it's the truth, and I'll prove it by the end of this video with an actual test. So anyways, this is the wattage that these breakers typically will allow through without tripping. It's on the threshold, but that's what a approximate number. So we take, in a case of MIG, a high efficiency welder. This would be like a Fronius, some of Miller's with power factor correction. Any welder that labels themselves as an inverter with power factor correction as a MIG welder will probably achieve something close to this. So I calculated out all of these numbers, and I know there's a lot of stuff on here, and we just need to focus on the purple numbers because that's what this whole formula gave us, and this is what we really are here for. So a conventional MIG welder that is an inverter and has power factor correction in basically a high efficiency inverter would be around 144 amps is the most that we could pull off of a 20 amp circuit. All these numbers are based on a 20 amp circuit. And that coincides with what we would expect. Like when you start seeing a lot of the higher end 120 volt MIG welders, they all claim 140 amps of output, and their duty cycle reflects at least a decent duty cycle at that. It is somewhat common to find welders that are not super high efficient that claim 140 amp output, but when you look at the duty cycle, aka how much time you can weld with them, it'll be like 10%. So what they're really telling you in a sly way is if you actually try and weld at this, you're just going to trip your breaker. So that's something to consider. The problem with this is the high efficiency MIG welders, so like a lot of the Fronius ones, your Millers, your higher end Millers, and the ESOB Rogue EM190, all of those have power factor correction, is that, well, they're $800,000-$900,000 or more. So you are not going to achieve this kind of number in output with any kind of cheap welder. It's just not possible. So 144 amps. Now a low efficiency, aka an older transformer machine, is only going to achieve about 85 amps of output. And that is why all older transformer welders universally, they had any decent output, were all 240 volt and 30 or 40 or 50 amp breakers, because that was the only way you could get any output out of them. So the modern technology gave us the actual ability to run on 120 and get some output. But if you have an expensive welder, you're going to get about this kind of output maximum on 120 20 amp. If you have an older machine that's inefficient, that's about what you're going to get. Now for TIG, this is a little bit misleading because the formula isn't wrong. These are the numbers: 202 amps with a high efficiency, 135 with a low efficiency. What you have to understand is that this does not account for inrush current, nor does this account for changes in arc gap. This is assuming a very tight arc and that you're welding at a consistent pace where that arc gap isn't going up and down as you're moving. So this is the theoretical maximum amperage you can get on a 20 amp circuit. Now most 120 volt capable TIG machines that are highly efficient are about 140 to 150 amps. And that's simply because of variations in arc gap length would easily trip if you go above about 150. So most machines limit themselves to less than that to prevent nuisance breaker trips. So a more realistic number with TIG is somewhere around 150 amps, absolute maximum, instead of 200. And then on a low efficiency, somewhere I would say around 90 to 100 amps. Again, the formula is not wrong. It's just that most of the TIG machines limit themselves to prevent nuisance breaker trips. More or less, the arc cuts out before you pull enough amperage to where it trips the breaker. So that is more realistic. Now, some machines may be able to go over this, even though they're lower efficiency, but you're not going to get much more than this. It's just not going to happen with the machines that are out there. Now for stick, this again, somewhat misleading. 135 amps on a high efficiency machine. Most machines are going to limit themselves to around 120 to 130. So this is a little bit higher than the reality, but it's close. And again, low efficiency, 75 amps, and that's really pushing it. Most low efficient stick welders like transformer machines would struggle to get 50 amps out at 24 volts. So that's something to consider there. Now with all of this information in your head, I'm going to condense this down and we're going to talk about the results. So what the hell does all that mean? Here's a simple thing that you can screenshot or write down that you can put in the I'll never see it again bin. And it covers all of the amperages that you can expect to see on a 20 amp circuit, just condensed down without all the BS on the previous part of this video. But these are realistic numbers of what you could expect, absolute maximum. And again, this is dependent on the machine. Some machines, even though they're highly efficient and have power factor correction, cannot achieve this for one reason or another. So this is a guideline of what to expect. And it's probably a lot lower than some of you expected for outputs, but this is the reality. And the reality is buying a more expensive welder that's designed to be efficient, that has power factor correction, is a better situation when you're running on 120 volts. My ESAB Rogue 200 can achieve 120 amps of stick output without a problem on a dedicated 20 amp breaker, and can easily achieve 140 amps of TIG output and weld like significant things for a fair amount of time on 120 volt, but that's because it's 90% efficient and has power factor correction. You're never going to achieve those kind of numbers with a cheap Amazon special welder. It's just not possible. Now, the next question you're probably wondering, well, if these are what I can get on a 20 amp breaker, why not a 30 amp? Well, here's the problem with that. A 30 amp breaker is not what any of these welders are designed around assuming you have, because if they were, they would just constantly trip your breakers, and that's not good. You don't want that. And I think at that point they would have to have a different plug on them, the 30 amp plug, which looks nothing like this 20 or the 15 that I showed you earlier. So that becomes an issue of safety. And the other issue is because they're not actually designed assuming that's what you're putting them on, their duty cycle typically is very poor on 120 volts. Most machines out there probably have a 10 to 15% duty cycle at max output on 120 volts. That's pretty poor. If you go to 240 volts on it, if it's a dual voltage machine, the output at that same level would probably be 40 or 50%. So again, they don't design around this, so the duty cycles will not take that in consideration. And with the cheaper welders that don't really have proper thermal overload, you might grossly exceed the machine's duty cycle. It won't shut off because they're assuming your breaker will trip before the machine overheats. I know it sounds stupid, but I've seen that with cheaper welders, and now you're just going to damage your machine. So this all plays a role, and it's basically, this is really your limit, okay? Don't think you can just slap this on a 30 amp breaker and everything's peachy. It doesn't work like that. So the last thing we're going to cover in this mess of data overload is we're going to talk about running these on a generator and why you're pretty much barking up the wrong tree attempting to do that. Since a bunch of viewers have sent me messages asking, like, what's the feasibility of buying a cheaper generator and running a 120 volt welder on it to save money, I wanted to explain this and why that isn't really going to work. And this is not just based on theory. I've tested this and have had very poor results. But let's look at what we're dealing with. A conventional household breaker, H for house, this is a household breaker. A 20 amp circuit, you can often pull 30 amps through that reliably with a welder and not trip it because, again, intermittent use. That's 2,400 watts on face value, 3,600 in actual. You can get a fair amount of output out of a welder on 3,600 watts. On 2,400, not so much, okay? On a 30 amp household breaker, you can oftentimes pull 43 to 47 amps through it, which is at least 5,160 watts versus the face value of 3,600. Like, household breakers and household electrical system has so much overhead available that, you know, overloading the breaker isn't much of a concern. The problem with a generator is you simply don't have that. So the fuses, which typically the round fuses on your generator, some of them have breakers similar to house, doesn't matter. All of those trip much closer to what their rating is on the face value. So a 20 amp rated round resettable fuse is pretty much going to trip at 22 amps. And my guess is it might even trip exactly at 20 amps. So you're only going to be able to pull 2640 roughly out of a 20 amp circuit on your generator before that breaker just trips. Now you can see a problem with that. If all welders that run on 120 overload circuits, well, an overload of here doesn't really matter. You have, almost 50% more power you can pull through that intermittently. Here you have like nothing. Therefore, your problem that's going to happen is because of the lack of overhead, you're just going to continuously trip the breaker on your generator, versus when you plug it into your home outlet 20 amp, you probably won't. And the same holds true on 30 amp. Same deal. 32 amps is about the most you're going to get through, which is barely any more wattage. And as a matter of fact, you can almost pull the same amount of wattage in your home 20 amp breaker that you could on a 30 amp breaker on your generator. And I don't make the rules, but this is just how it is. And this is only part of the problem that you're facing running on a generator. The other problem is you're limited to how much generator output you have. In a household, you have a main breaker that's 20,000 plus watts of availability before that trips. Well, on a generator, whatever the generator's running watts are, that's all you have. So if you have a 3550 generator running watt, guess what? You're not going to be able to even pull this even if you have a 30 amp breaker. And I've seen plenty of generators that have breakers that are rated for more than the output of the machine. And it's kind of all a marketing scam, to be honest. Like, oh, it's got a 30 amp. Yeah, it does, but you can only pull 28 amps through it. And so what I'm getting at is, if you're running on a generator, the feasibility of running a 120 volt machine and making it work is going to be piss poor. Now, this is going to sound kind of counterintuitive, but an older transformer machine will probably work better on a generator on 120 volts in a modern inverter. And the reason is this: the older transformer machines don't care what the input voltage is, what the quality of the power is. They'll just start lowering their output at higher output as a generator struggles to supply them enough voltage. They don't care. They still weld, right? The problem is modern inverters need stable voltage coming into it. If you don't have stable voltage and the power, the waveform starts turning to crap, they're going to shut off on their own. So the ability to weld on 120 volts on a generator is far better, even at lower output with a transformer machine, than any kind of modern computer-filled or circuitry-filled welder. They don't like that kind of stuff. So realistically, if you only have a generator to work with and you want to weld with it and it's only 120 volt, you're honestly probably better off finding a machine that's a transformer based, just to get it to where it works and it doesn't shut off. And the problem gets even worse than this, because a lot of generators can't output this kind of power through a single circuit, even though they have higher output. And let's go and look at the generator I run all the welders on this channel on. So here's my Predator 9500. This is around 7600 running watts, I believe. This is typical of an inverter generator, and the rating of it, the running watts, is basically what you need to concern yourself with when you run a welder. The starting watts is all bogus. It's just claims. It doesn't matter. You can't utilize any of that. Every breaker on this, it has 220 amps, and a 30 amp for 120 volts, and then this, which is a resettable breaker, is a 240 volt breaker. Every one of these trips at basically face value, so 20 amps, 30 amps, or 30 amps. So because of that, the ability to run welders that overload circuits is a significant issue, because every 120 volt welder overloads a circuit. Well, if this doesn't allow any overload of any circuit, guess what? You're going to trip breakers. Now, you could theoretically run a 20 amp circuit, and rather than running on that, you run on this 30 amp twist lock, and I've tried that with a 120 volt welder. The problem is most 120 volt welders out there actually draw somewhere around 31 to 33 amps in order to output maximum current. Well, that's over this breaker rating, so this is going to trip. So that is a severe limitation you're going to run into, and that is why anytime someone asks me about running a 120 volt welder on a generator, the feasibility of it, I universally say good luck. because almost all of them are going to simply overload it, trip the breaker, and cause problems. That's why if you have any ambitions on welding on a generator, do not waste money on a 120 volt only generator. When you go to the 240 volt capable generators, the breakers on those often have enough of a rating to where you can actually get some output. Like even a 20 amp 240 outlet, you might be able to weld 1/8 inch 3/16 metal okay. But if you don't have at least a 20 amp 240, you're in trouble. Like you're just going to trip breakers constantly and you're not going to get any welding done. All right, so here's a janky setup. We have a Art Captain El Cheapo flux core wire welder there on the left, and then I'm metering basically the output voltage of the machine along with the output amperage, and in that gray box on the right there next to the 2 meters, that's measuring real-time consumption and wattage, and it also will tell us what the reactive power is along with the power factor of the machine. And I'll let you in on a secret. It's pretty bad. The power factor isn't that good, and it definitely isn't that efficient. So let's look at the Magic Pixie reader in order to be on the same page. So this device gives us a lot of information that's useful. On number 1 there, that's the input voltage to the machine, aka what's coming out of the wall, which is 122 volts. Number 2 is the wattage that the machine actually consumes. This is not a fictitiously high number due to reactive power. This is basically only what the machine uses. Number 3 is the frequency, which in North America, 120 volts, we're at 60 hertz. And then number 4 is the current. The current reflects actual current, so what the device is using, along with the reactive current to give an idea of what the breaker would actually see for a current. I will have to calculate out what the actual consumption of current is because it's actually going to be lower than what box number 4 says, but I'll do that for you guys. Now, number 5 is energy in watt hours. That isn't really too much of a concern. It's just a different way to look at that. And then, of course, number 6 is a calculated power factor. Welders with power factor correction that are highly efficient will often achieve 0.99 or 1.0 power factor. And what that means is that the current that you will read in box 4 will more or less match the actual consumed current because it's not spitting reactive power back to the wall. Therefore, breakers are less likely to trip. Well, let's look at the test welds I did and the actual test results metering the machine. Here is a test weld plate. It's the one on the left with 3 welds. It's 3.2 millimeter or 1/8 inch material and run at somewhere around 110 amps. So there's a lot going on here. Let's go through it. The output voltage of the welder for that weld we just saw is about 18.96, 19 volts, and the output amperage it took to weld that is about 113, 114 amps. So that's a decent amount of output power. Now the input power, it consumed 2,660 watts at 109 volts. Now the 120 volts is what was fed into it. However, there's voltage drop, likely due to a number of factors such as wire size and the fact that we're overloading the wire. So all of this information comes together that we saw a 24.4 amp actual consumption of that machine plus the reactive power that it's outputting back towards the power grid, which gives us 31 amps that 20 amp circuit is seeing when we're welding 1/8 inch material. Yes, that is correct. It's not an error. 31 amps. Even if its power factor was not 0.78 like the little screen says and it was more like a higher end welder's 1.0, it would still be the 24.425 amp loading. So this device, despite outputting 114 amps, which is under its rated output, actually overloads breakers. Now, if you were to sit and do enough welding with this, absolutely the breaker would trip, but the machine in theory would probably shut off and go into thermal overload before that happens, but it's hard to say. And that's the problem with a lot of cheaper machines with poor power factor and fairly poor efficiency on 120 volts, is that every one of them completely overloads breakers, and ultimately the cheaper ones will probably result in tripping of the breakers. To make matters worse, this machine run on a generator would likely trip a 30 amp breaker because you're seeing 31 amps already, and we're only welding 1/8 inch material. So the limit of what this could do on, a 3500 running watt generator is probably about 1/8 inch material. If you crank it up any more than where it's at for settings, it's just going to end up tripping the breaker, and that's exactly what I found. This welder would not weld on my Predator 9500 on a 30 amp 120 outlet. All it would do is either trip the breaker or the machine would start acting funny because the input voltage drops so low. And universally, you're going to find this is the problem with every 120 volt capable welder. All of them overload breakers, and all of them are going to be almost impossible to run on a generator, with the exception of some older school transformer machine will likely weld at reduced output. But again, it's still going to trip the breaker when you try and weld anything decent. That's why you really need to stick to 240 volts off a generator and a 240 volt welder to get any kind of reasonable output. Now let's look at a little bit higher of output. I maxed the machine out and calculated out all of the numbers, and it's pretty crazy. So the plate that I welded is in the upper right. It was 3/16 thick or quarter, and it took quite a bit of power, but we maxed the machine out. Let's see what we got for numbers. So the data is pretty absurd here. Our output voltage is 21.16, which is pretty decent. Output amps out of that little sucker is 139 amps. I don't know that it would weld too long at that before it would probably burn up, but that's what we see here. Now, as far as power consumption, it's actually consuming 3,660 watts, and the voltage has dropped to 103 volts, again, likely because it's overloading its own power cord, which is probably 14 gauge, by the way. That equals 35.53 amps of actual power consumption. And then, of course, because the power factor is relatively poor and it's spitting reactive power back out, the actual breaker loading that the breaker would see is 45 amps. So that's absolutely absurd. Good luck finding any generator that would handle that kind of a load on a 120 outlet without letting a breaker trip. Again, generators are designed a lot different with breakers because there isn't enough power to allow overloads like this. Therefore, they're a little bit more cautious, because that's exactly how you end up burning internal wires and stuff on circuitry, putting that kind of a load on it. Now, its power factor's at 0.78, 0.80. It bounced between there, which isn't that bad. I've seen far worse from a lot of other welders, so that's at least something good to say about it. But again, this thing is massively overloading breakers, and honestly, with the current that it's putting on the input, I wouldn't be surprised if the magnetic trip was just about to trip. I only ran a 4-5 second weld roughly, and my guess is if I would have welded any longer, it would have tripped the house breaker at 20 amps, which is a dedicated 20 amps. I'm honestly shocked that the magnetic trip didn't trip, but a lot of times that's set at like 47 to 50 amps on a 20 amp breaker. So again, all of this pretty much adds up to the fact that these things suck, and you're not going to be running them on a generator anytime soon, and you're better off with a 240 volt welder. Hopefully all of that stuff makes sense for you. So what did we learn today? Well, we learned that the feasibility of using a welder on a 120 volt generator is going to be limited at best. And honestly, your results are going to vary heavily. I personally have tried almost every welder I have that runs dual voltage on the generator that I have there, as well as a couple other generators and wall outlets. And universally, all of them overload the breaker above 20 amps, and the breaker doesn't trip because, again, they trip on thermal cycles or the thermal curve. And as long as you stay far enough under and you use a duty cycle, it will handle it. The problem is generators don't have that. They are not designed to let you overload particular breakers. They're designed to allow, say, you're running watts over multiple outlets, and that is how you can achieve more of what they call starting watts, is because multiple circuits are loaded, but none of the single circuits are loaded to maximum. And that's the problem, is that welders load circuits to above maximum. Therefore, your ability to use adapter cords like this and magically weld on a generator is going to be very poor. Now, on a household breaker, if you want to actually weld in your garage and you don't have 240 volts, but you have access to a dedicated 20 amp circuit, you can actually get functional welding output with stick and TIG and MIG and actually do a lot of welding with it. It's just not on a generator. On a household breaker, yes. So the practical limitations of around 120 amps or stick, 140 to 50 with TIG, and about 130, 140 with MIG, you can actually do a lot of welding like at those amperages in the household. So yes, 120 volt welders, the high efficiency modern ones, which unfortunately mostly cost above $600 to $800 and higher, actually do give a tremendous amount of output with limited power. So if you only have a 20 amp breaker in your house or your garage and you want to actually build stuff, look at a TIG welder or look at a stick welder or MIG welder that's super efficient. Yes, it's going to cost you a bunch of money, but you can do a ton of stuff with it. Case in point, I did a repair on a broken ram mount with a 120 volt 20 amp circuit with my ESAB Rogue 200. I'll put a picture of it up right now. I did the whole job on a literal 20 amp circuit. I stick welded multiple pass and TIG the root, all of that on limited power. So absolutely you can. You just need a highly efficient machine to do that, like the Rogue 200 or any number of like Fronius and Miller, Max Star, all of those. And you would be amazed at what you can do. But unfortunately, again, hate to beat a dead horse, you can forget about that kind of stuff on a generator. They just aren't designed to be overloaded in the way that a home household breaker can. So with that said, I know this is a complicated topic. I know I probably overcomplicated some things, oversimplified others, and probably filled your head with a bunch of useless knowledge. But my hope is that at least you'll have a better idea of what's going on, what to calculate to figure it out on your own. And if you don't understand anything, leave a comment and I'll respond to it and answer it. So hopefully this helped you out. Until next time.